Hello. Today I'm in Jesus College, Oxford, and I'm talking to Chris Smaje, who, to my mind, is a very, very significant thinker in agricultural matters. And not only is a thinker, but is actually a doer, because he has had his own market garden for goodness knows how long. He started life, however, as a sociologist, and then in 2008, together with his wife Cordelia, started a market garden come smallholding called Vallis Veg. And since then he's written two books, both doing very well, I might say. The first called A Small Farm Future, which was published in 2020, and the second, Say No to a Farm-Free Future, which is a riposte to George Monbiot's ideas about the end of farming, basically, which was published last year and has caused a great stir. So, can I start by talking about the first of the two books, A Small Farm Future? Well, what's it all about?
Well, basically, I suppose it was my big book of ideas that kind of emerged from thinking and doing a bit of farming over the previous years. And I mean, I guess what it's about is that I think whether we like it or not, the future for a lot of people is going to be more local, lower energy, more people on the land, more local food and fibre production. And in many ways that can be quite a positive story, but it's not wholly positive, and I think a lot of the drivers that are pushing us in that direction are potentially problematic. So the book was really trying to lay out, why is that a likely future, whether we like it or not, and to some extent, I think now, with issues like climate change and energy futures, water, soil, and socioeconomic drivers as well, I kind of think it's a little bit out of our hands how that plays out. But nevertheless, there are better and worse ways that we can try and take the narrative. And so the book was really, what I didn't want to do is just sort of say, here's my blueprint for how everything will be great in the future, or, there's a lot of books like that. If you follow my 3-point plan,
Okay.
I don't think yours. Well, you've very much been an inspiration for the approach, for my thinking. But it's easy to sort of lay out blueprints about, how everything will turn out fine, and I didn't really want to do that, but I did want to focus on. We were talking before we started recording about issues like rent and the nature of the economy. So, these are big sort of crunchy issues that have been with us from the year dot. And, we need to be facing those issues with I think, more localist, more agrarian, more small scale kind of hat on. So the book really was an attempt to kind of really to scope the ground for that, because there isn't an awful lot of writing. You're an exception, but there's not an awful lot of writing that is taking seriously the idea of a lower energy agrarian future. So I felt that was something that I felt moved to do.
What's fairly obvious is that what you're saying is very much against the current trend. Mm-hmm. That's absolute opposite of what governments think and corporates think and so on.
Yes.
You want to expand on that, or?
Well,
the question is why. What they say, whatever actually they mean, but what they say is that your kind of scenario of a more agrarian, localised future is simply implausible. We simply couldn't feed the world, as the expression is, if we went down that route. Now, what's your answer to that?
Well, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about that. One of the realities of contemporary agriculture is a huge amount of overproduction. It's particularly arable grains. I think the figure is something like 75% of global cropland is devoted to 10 crops, most of which are cereals or grain legumes. And a lot of those don't feed people directly. They feed livestock, or we even, we use them for biofuels, or, making various kind of industrial food or non-food products. So there is quite a lot of slack, within developing local food systems to actually feed people well on less land. And also there's, the so-called inverse productivity relationship where, what drives the contemporary industrial food paradigm is not efficient production of food. It's efficient production of money. Ultimately, it's driving the profit margins. And so, there's plenty of research that shows people, small-scale people who are geared to feeding themselves can actually produce as much or more food per acre than than the sort of large-scale contemporary industrial food systems. I mean, it's complicated, and but in general, I don't think feeding the world is the problem for small-scale agriculture. It's kind of how we get there, socioeconomically, politically, that's the problem. And as you say, that's not the direction the world is going in or has been going in recently. But I think these big drivers that I mentioned, like climate change, like energy futures, and also socioeconomic drivers, I think by default may end up pushing a lot of people to start developing local food systems. And I guess my mantra is that if it's better to try and make that work ahead of time by design than it happening by default in a chaotic sort of way.
Yeah. One thing actually we could discuss in passing is that, given that your sort of scenario to me and to a lot of other people is very attractive, and given, as you say, that you really could provide everybody with good food going down your route, why don't, as it were, the powers that be see this? Why do they cling so assiduously to a system that really doesn't actually work, doesn't feed everybody, makes a big mess of the environment? Why do they cling to it?
One could have a more or less cynical answer about that, about the way that power works, but I think we have become very wedded to deeply interconnected global systems that run on the currency, partly, in material terms, in the currency of cheap energy, but in economic terms, in the currency of money. And it's quite hard to unstitch, those energy and those financial systems. So, like you say, people like you and me coming along saying, this isn't going to end well. We need to unpick this. It is a fair question to ask of us. Well, how? And my answer is, well, if we don't, it's going to unpick itself somehow or other. So I think there's an enormous amount of inertia in the system. Is one answer. And the other aspect to it, which perhaps we'll come to later, is about the stories we tell, the myths that we tell about ourselves. And there is a kind of myth of progress, of dematerialization from the land, of people moving from local land-based lives into something else, more industrial, more urban, whatever. And that, I think, has a powerful hold on a lot of people. Again, I think it's an old story, really, that isn't going to persist in the future, but it is very much the mainstream story that a lot of people currently live by.
Yeah, sure. Let's then talk about how you switched careers in 2008, big time. And because before that you had been a perfectly respectable academic, teaching, studying sociology, and then you switched to small-time farming, smallholding, market gardening. Many people would say that's perverse, because being an academic, frankly, is a bit of a soft option, whereas being a market garden very obviously isn't. So why did you make the switch?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in some ways, the soft option is part of it. If I try and put a retrospective intellectual gloss over it, I think, again, going back to that issue of stories and myths, you can have a well-paid academic job where you write a lot of stuff, and both money and words, writing, it's easy for us to kind of fit, to sort of change the narrative, to use money, use words to tell a story that we want to tell. whereas farming, you're part of a wider ecosystem that doesn't necessarily dance to your tune. So, and likewise, running a small business, so in some ways, I think it was a good reality check. Why I made the switch personally, I suppose, although you've introduced me as a sociologist, which is true, I taught in a sociology department. Originally, I studied anthropology and spent a certain amount of time interested in global peasant production, kind of it in a slightly intellectual sort of way about peasant consciousness and so on. I didn't actually know anything about actual food production at that time, but I suppose it sort of stayed with me a little bit in a way that there are people, living other kinds of lives and quite grounded in local food systems. And I suppose around that time, around the turn of the millennium, climate issues around climate change and energy futures were rising up the agenda, and it felt to me and my wife that food was very much at the centre of that, and so kind of within many limitations. I don't want to present my farm or the way that we've done things as any kind of exemplar that everybody should follow, but we've sort of done our best to develop it in a thoughtful way with those sorts of things in mind. So kind of wanted to walk the talk a little bit, and like you say, academia can be an easy option, but I was always felt a little bit caged by it. I guess I'm there is an outdoorsy aspect to my personality, so it felt quite good in some ways to swap the common room for the great outdoors. So yeah, different things came together at that time, and it probably was a bit mad, but that's what we did.
But how physically were you able to do it? You were married at the time, obviously, to Cordelia.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether you had children.
Yeah, we had 3 small boys, so it was quite insane. In fact, before we did it, we spent 18 months travelling around Canada, mostly in a caravan with the boys, woofing, volunteering on farms, trying to learn how to farm, and then we stayed on an island off the west coast of British Columbia, where Cordelia did a course in ecological gardening. It was called, at Linnea Farm. So yeah, it was a big switch, and the only way we were really able to do it, I think perhaps later we'll come on to talking about the nature of economics and rent. We basically bought a flat in London in 1990 odd, and that enabled us to finance buying a small acreage in Somerset. The way that
value.
The way economics work. Huge inflation of property values, and also obviously a few square metres in London translates to a bigger area of farmland in Somerset, and there's some interesting economics around that are very germane, I think, to a small farm future. But that was essentially how we financed it. The other side of it is that if you are able to set up a small farm and produce things for yourself, food, energy, and so on, you don't necessarily need to earn as much income as if you're, certainly if you're living in London or somewhere. So, we've been kind of capital rich, but income poor, really, but we haven't, our lifestyle isn't that extravagant, and, we produce a lot of our basic needs for ourselves. So, there's that's roughly how we've managed it. But it is difficult. I think farming at all scales, everything is so is so pushed to the economic margins. It's hard to make a reasonable income farming. So, people do other things, and farm diversification is the name of the game, which we've done to some extent. But come back to the notion that ultimately you need to eat. You need to be producing food and fibre locally. So I think that has to be front and centre of the longer term vision.
What incidentally does Cordelia do? What did she do? Did she give up a job to do it with you?
Not as such. I mean, she'd done a lot of travelling in her youth, and then did various jobs, and then had kids, and then carried on doing various jobs. And as I did, the first few years we didn't do much on the land apart from plant some trees, and carried on working and raising the kids. But she's very much been the kind of driving force of the farm locally, kind of thinking through the human relationships. I mean, she's a better grower and more sort of practically gifted than me in many ways. So she's like, really at the core of making the farm work. And I was when we started the box scheme, I was the main grower for about 5 years, and then I sort of gradually drifted back into my writerly ways, and I still do quite a bit of work on the farm, but then she sort of pushed the market garden forward. She was the primary person, or has been the primary person doing that for the last few years.
So you bought 8 acres.
18 acres 18? Altogether, yeah.
But you were never actually able to build a house on the place? Or
no, we did, but that was a big issue where, we started the market garden. Our site is just on the edge of the town of Frome, but we were living in the town about a mile away from the market garden and raising kids as well. It was kind of impossible to do, really, in that way. So then we applied for planning permission to live on the land. In fact, initially, it's a sort of interesting thing when you just buy a bare acreage, no infrastructure, nothing on the site at all, apart from grass and hedges. It's quite a big thing to sort of develop that into a functioning holding. So we started talking about building a barn, and then we were kind of like, well, hang on, it's not even really working economically. So, before we have a barn, we need a house. And so that was a sort of multi-year journey with the planning, the authorities and the powers that be. But yeah, now we are living on the site, and it was really the living on the site that made it possible to sort of make it work within certain caveats going forwards. And that, I think, is a key thing in terms of a larger small farm future, is that we have to somehow get people to be back living on, inhabiting the land. I mean, you've written about this as well, and it's a hard thing to do within.
I haven't actually done it. I've only written about it.
Well, even writing about it is
oh, that's pretty hard. Yeah.
Is the start. We need to confront that issue. I think, big time.
Can we talk about your business itself? What have you grown over the years, etc., etc.? How did you make it pay? Is the other thing.
Well, with difficulty. We basically have a small market garden, a veg box scheme. So we are growing a range of seasonal veg and delivering it to people locally in town. And if you work hard at that, and if you're a good grower and a good business person and a good people person, you can probably, we did sort of make it work. You can probably earn something around minimum wage, if you sort of calculate it out. So if your outgoings aren't too big, you can make it work. People do make it work. But it's hard. I mean, the market garden is only small. The other parts of the site are, we've got a lot of woodland, and which we planted when we first came to the site. So, a whole interesting set of issues about wood and forestry, I think. And we retained some grassland, so we have raised a little bit of livestock from time to time over the years. Well, basically hens, pigs and sheep, but mostly not commercially, but for our own and sort of friends and so on. So obviously, again, big issues around livestock in agriculture. But and there are other, we've tried to be community minded. We've got allotments on the site, so local, just private arrangement really with kind of 20 odd local people that grow their own fruit and veg on the site. We've got an educational project, Shared Earth Learning, that operates from the site, and we've got a little campsite. So in terms of farm diversification, that's been, interesting issues there. It's a lot easier just to sort of tell someone, here, you can put your tent there and the toilet is over there, 20 quid please, or whatever, as compared to trying to sell lettuces or whatever else it is, so sort of interesting economics around that as well. But
I remember a few years ago at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference, you gave a talk in which you said that you started off with sort of big ideals about growing all sorts of nice things, and as time went on, you more and more had to compromise and just grow what you could sell. How did that work, or was it disappointing?
I think it worked. I think there's an aspect of that both on the producer and the consumer side. there are growers I see who grow this incredible diversity of plants and vegetables and flowers, and I'm always very impressed. My mind, I can't really cope with that level of complexity. So I think from a grower's point of view, there's something to be said for concentrating on a manageable number of crops. I've just been looking at Ben Hartman's the micro farm book, and he basically concentrates on a very small scale on growing 4 crops. And then obviously that can be part of a wider, I'm not a big fan of monocultures, so you can incorporate lots of other things, but in terms of, there's something to be said from a grower's point of view about not trying to do too much, I think. But yeah, from the consumer point of view, I think partly it's in the marketing. If you're good at marketing things, you can get people to buy weird and wonderful stuff. But things like lemon cukes that I love, but most people don't know. They're little cucumbers that look like lemons. So there's this great diversity of wonderful old varieties of vegetable crops that you just can't really get in the supermarkets. So my original thinking would be, people will love this because you can't get this in the supermarket. And, there's an element of truth to that, but there's also, what the hell do I do with this? I don't know what this is. You don't see this in the supermarket, So I think you have to be realistic and sort of negotiate that terrain. But I think, there is a lot of skill in the marketing and the communication with customers, which, there were aspects of that I was good at and other aspects I was less good at. But, that is, as a small producer, you do have to retain the retail connection. It doesn't really work to produce stuff wholesale. And that does mean that you end up, the positive is that you end up interacting with the end customer a lot. The downside is that can be quite a lot of work, and sort of wrangling over 5 quid that somebody owes you or whatever, But the opportunity there is to have those conversations about, genetic variation in crops and, old varieties and so on. So, I wouldn't say it's impossible to do that, but I think you can't just assume that customers are gonna sort of love all your crazy ideas about how farming ought to be. You have to sort of go out there and communicate it, I would say.
Haven't you got any sort of restaurateur friends who would share your crazy ideas and would want you to grow lemon cukes?
There are growers I know who seem to do, they seem to sell to restaurants, and that seems to work for them. It didn't really work for me. Maybe I didn't try it seriously enough. Frome has, I suppose the word would be, gentrified a bit over the years. When we first came there was only one restaurant, and now there's loads of them. But my attempts to sell to restaurant wasn't that great. I think there aren't any sort of hard and fast rules that apply everywhere. Again, that localism emphasis everywhere is a little bit different. So by and large, a veg box scheme worked quite well for us, and in later years we've been delivering boxes on an electric trike, which we charge up mostly from our PV panels on our holding, and that's a bit of a local talking point, you know. So there's sort of things like that.
What crops have actually worked for you?
I mean, I guess we've mostly just grown the usual seasonal varieties. You know, on a small scale, growing the winter root crops is a bit touch and go, you know, in terms of margins. Although, you know, you can once they're in the ground, you can sort of keep them ticking over a period. I mean, you know, the thing that a lot of small scale growers do is winter salads, you know, oriental salads, and that they work quite well because you're not at a competitive disadvantage to the sort of bigger and more mechanized operators. So, you know, I've certainly done that over the years, and you know, it's great going into a frozen polytunnel, and as soon as the sun comes out, you know, they look, you know, perfectly, you know, they're great, ready to go. But, you know, I suppose perhaps one of my naiveties was when I started, I had these sort of pretensions to, you know, not to feeding the world, but at least to feeding my corner of the world. And, you know, if you go too far down the route of sort of gourmet salad garnishes, you know, it doesn't feel like you're necessarily being true to that. But on the other hand, I think one way or another, we just need people who are producing food locally. And, you know, I think we need to break down, I think something that you've said over the years is breaking down the difference between the sort of commercial grower and the amateur grower, and sort of all gradations in between. So I've become less critical, I think, of anybody who's managing to produce some food and sell it, you know, it is basically a hero.
Shall we now switch direction a bit and talk about economic theory, about which I know very little, I might say, but I've read a bit over the years, as it were.
Sure.
And I mean, what you're talking about, selling stuff that you can grow well and you know you can sell. This is David Ricardo, isn't it? This is the whole theory of comparative advantage going back to the early 19th century. Do you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's interesting that, because in some ways I think that we've got into this real kind of snafu with comparative advantage or local specialism. And I should preface this by saying, like you, I'm not an economist, but have read a bit of economic theory over the years. So I think...
Anyway, some people say that it's better not to be a theorist.
I think it can be. It can be. We need to, well, you know, as with David Ricardo back in those days when he was writing, people called it political economy, which I think is a much better term, because we, you know, nowadays we tend to talk about the economy in this very disembedded way, and the people like Ricardo and Adam Smith and so on were very much part of agrarian societies and were thinking about food and land use in ways that has sort of been lost from modern economics.
It's very important, actually. People misunderstand Adam Smith in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, you know, there was, in some ways, there was no greater critique of modern capitalism and industrialism than Adam Smith, you know. But Ricardo, yeah, it was. I mean, the idea of that is that it's best to specialise. You know, basically his argument was that, you know, if you want to make the biggest profit, it's best to specialise in what you do best and let other people specialise in what they do best. And, you know, there are reasons why that doesn't work, particularly with the flow of capital around the world. But I think the way that has worked in modern large-scale agriculture is that every part of the world, you know, because basically you can move food around the world using cheap, basically fossil energy very, very easily, every part of the world is not really geared to feeding its local population anymore. It's geared to producing whatever it can produce most advantageously in global markets. And that's why, you know, I raised the issue of the campsite earlier. You know, it's sort of interesting that we can sort of make a living running a campsite because there's only so many campsites in Somerset, and all the campsite owners are faced with roughly the same set of economic conditions, whereas if you grow food, you are basically competing with whoever in the world can produce that food with a set of labour and energy inputs and natural endowments. So that forces everywhere to really specialise its agriculture. So then we get these whole debates about maybe there are too many sheep being produced in the upland regions of Britain, but that's because if you want to be competitive in a global marketplace and you live in North Wales, say, sheep is probably one of the few products that you can put into those markets. Whereas if we had more local food systems, then you would get more diversity. So I think, if we get away from that Ricardian idea of comparative advantage and maximising profit and start thinking more in terms of, well, what do we actually need to live locally? We need food, we need housing, we need energy. How can we produce that? I'm not saying there should be no trade or no interchange with the wider world, but I think it works better ecologically and also socially to put some limits around that.
Let us move on to your second book, Say No to a Farm-Free Future, which is a kind of riposte to George Monbiot's book, which was called Regenesis, Feeding the World Without Devouring the Planet. And just to sort of anticipate, just to set the scene for George himself, this is what he says at the end of his own book, quote, "It is time to create a new, rich, productive and ideally organic agriculture, no longer dependent on livestock, growing food that is cheap, healthy and available to everyone. It is time to develop a new and revolutionary cuisine based on farm-free food. We can now contemplate the end of most farming, the most destructive force ever to have been unleashed by humans." It's grand rhetoric, but you don't really agree with it.
No. I largely agree with the first part of it in terms of its time to produce, what was it, something and mostly organic.
Productive, ideally organic, no longer dependent on livestock.
Well, yeah, maybe we need to talk about livestock. I found it a curious book in that that mentioning of organic is a case in point where if you look at the rest of his book, almost everything he says about organic farming is negative. He doesn't say a lot about organic farming, but he's mostly negative about organic farming. And then in the final bit you quote, he kind of says it'd be good to have ideally organic farming. And so part of the issue I've had sort of trying to get my head around his book and debating it with people is people will point to that kind of passage and say, look, you're saying he's against agroecology or organic farming, but look, he says here ideally organic farming. And to my mind, the book does have that slight flavour of a religious text where it has so much ambiguity and, it kind of has something for everybody in it, so you can, you end up sort of debating endlessly, well, what does he actually mean? What does he want? But I think the book really lands, I'm not the best person to give an unbiased summary of George's book. But a quick summary of it would be, the first part explains what a mess modern agriculture is in, and I think, you've written brilliantly about that. I don't think there's any disagreement there. I think he does slightly tend to blame that on farming itself rather than those wider economic structures we were just talking about, the David Ricardo and so on. But anyway, I've got no great objections to the first part of the book. Then he has some chapters where he looks at different people doing different kinds of things in farming, trying to make farming, more ecologically benign and more productive. And there's a sort of slight element of, well, nice try, lads, but you you don't quite pull it off. And then the book really lands in that last bit that you read out about farm-free, these, well, they're not that new, the techniques, but yeah, basically new techniques of industrial, factory-based food synthesis. And then he has a very problematic chapter where he basically says the whole kind of positive thing about farming is just this pastoral mythology that we've inherited from, the likes of Virgil and, the old pastoral poets. But the book very much lands on farm-free production, on industrial manufacture of bacterially based food. And yeah, so that's, my book, I guess. I should say that part of the reason that George is so keen on it is because allegedly it has a lower land footprint. So as as in that quotation, his argument is that farming is incredibly destructive of nature and wild creatures, which again, it's complicated. I certainly don't entirely disagree with that. So the argument is that if we can sort of dematerialize ourselves, if we can, decrease our land footprint of farming and sort of disentangle ourselves from nature, then then everyone, including the wild creatures, will be better off. But I don't think that's the case, and so my book was really just trying to explore that.
I mean, one thing. It is the case that bacteria and other microorganisms, well, bacteria are the main ones, obviously, are very, very efficient in terms of turning raw materials into edible stuff or putatively edible stuff. So there's the efficiency side, which is a good thing. So there are positives.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with it is, I think there's, again, to come back to economic language, there's an important distinction between efficiency and cost, and there is the cost of bacterial protein synthesis is that you need to use supplied primary energy. It is energized with electricity, and you have to, humans have to create that electricity somehow, whereas farming is energized by sunlight. So if we, and farming is more or less the only major economic sector which has a zero cost, zero carbon energy source. So the problem is, one of the fundamental, I mean, there are various problems to my mind with the manufactured food idea, but the fundamental problem is that we need to decarbonise the energy supply, and we're not doing a very good job of that, even as things stand. But mostly we're producing food not using primary energy, but using sunlight. So how we are going to better decarbonise the existing energy system whilst also using it to produce food rather than using sunlight, I think it just doesn't stack up. That is the fundamental problem with it. I'm sure it has a place, particularly, a lot of the places that are really pushing it forward are Scandinavian countries where there's a lot of low carbon energy in the form of hydro and not much good farmland. So in certain situations, it probably has a place, but as a kind of mass global food solution, I mean, I think it just doesn't stack up.
You actually talk about some actual figures. Would you like to throw a few figures at it?
Well, one of the things in my book, I think George, if I remember rightly, claims that you can produce a kilo of microbial protein for 17.6 kilowatt hours of electrical energy or energy input into the process. I mean, I think I've clearly demonstrated that that's wrong, and it's at least 65 kilowatt hours per kilo, if not more. Whereas if you look at, for example, US, big scale mechanized soy farming, you're talking about something like 1 kilowatt hour per kilo. You know, if you're growing soy or some other bean in your back garden, you know, the energy input is virtually nothing. And so that's the issue, really. You know, we just cannot afford to use precious energy. If you think we can get rid of that and replace it, you know, something like the existing energy economy with low carbon replacements that are, you know, as cheap and as abundant, then maybe you could, you know, maybe you can then make a case for manufactured food. But I just don't see that happening in the sort of timeframes that are relevant in terms of climate change and other crises that we face. So it's a non-starter. I think that, you know, the future is going to be a farmed future, and the question then is, you know, how do we make that as good for people and as good for nature as we possibly can? But I think things like manufactured food are, you know, they're a kind of techno fix, kind of bit of wizardry that is actually a distraction from what we need to be focusing on.
It is true, after all, that if you set out to farm in a wildlife-friendly way, you could be really quite wildlife-friendly. You could never replace a tropical rainforest, but you can do a pretty good job.
Yeah, and that's a big debate, you know, which I think you know, George talks about in his book, and I talk about it in my book. I think he's a little bit too dismissive of exactly that possibility of having nature-friendly farming. And of course, there is that context that we talked about at the beginning of the discussion, overproduction. You know, one thing we can do is not be doing agriculture wastefully by you know, by having a kind of economic system that just encourages us to sort of expand the frontier of agricultural production in pursuit of profit. You know, it comes back to this localism idea that if we are trying to produce food for human communities, you know, there comes a point when you stop and can leave more space for nature. So I think the only way that we are going to really sort of see things through with as many wild things as possible is if we're implicated, we're protagonists within the kind of wider ecosphere.
Let's just talk about you again. I mean, you are now sort of winding up Vallis Veg in its original form, moving on. What are you doing and why?
So the last few years we have moved to a model where we've essentially tried to develop this 2-year kind of informal, ad hoc, most of the things we do are informal and ad hoc, training program where we take somebody on to learn the ropes of the market garden and particularly the business side of it, which you know, a lot of people have quite good growing skills but not necessarily know sort of experienced of running a business in all all the aspects of that. So we had a program where people did that, and then in the second year would become the market garden manager. Essentially we lent them the business and they took the lion's share of the business profits. But it was sort of, the idea was that it's kind of a big step from being an apprentice grower, say in a market garden, to running your own business. And because we sort of established the infrastructure and so on, it was an opportunity for people to learn to do that, and it meant that we would have more time, you know, rather than doing all of the growing and so on ourselves, to do other things. Thankfully, we got 2 young growers who we've met through, you know, just sort of various connections in the horticulture world, and they are coming and taking it on as their own business. So hopefully it will continue, but it will be them doing it and not us.
You're going to carry on living on the land?
We hope to carry on living on the land. We've sort of got a little bunch of people there doing all sorts of different things. We are sort of trying to get, I mean, it feels, well, it's a bit like retiring, only having even more to do than you did before, but definitely trying to do more food production that isn't, I mean, you know, we were talking earlier about the way that you know, the commercial, financial drivers of food production kind of push you in certain directions. So if you step outside of that, you know, we're focusing more on producing food for ourselves and the wider community.
I mean, I have this idea, as you know, that in order to put the world to rights, we need to rethink everything, and we need to rethink everything from first principles, and that the first principles are actually those of ecology and morality, rather than those of money. And there's got to be, it all amounts to a renaissance, a rebirth, and it's got to be people-led. And I've come on to realise that before you have the Renaissance, you have to have a kind of global movement. So what you're talking about, it seems to me, is very much contributing towards the global movement, which could move us on.
I think all sorts of ways in which people can, you know, create sort of community movements and local movements around producing food, you know, whatever that might be.
Just a last point, I mean, we should never give up hope, as St. Paul said, but hope and optimism are not the same things. And I just want to ask you, is there any plausible reason to be optimistic at this stage of the game?
Well, as you say, I think hope and optimism are different things. I think there's always reasons to be hopeful. I think you need to have a kind of fairly cold-eyed, realistic analysis of where you think the world is going, and then once you have that, then try and amplify the most positive outcomes you can. But I think there's a lot of what people call hopium around some of these kind of techno-fix ideas, you know, like manufactured food fall into this, where you know, people latch on to, you know, whatever it might be as this kind of saviour technology, and are very scornful of, you know, what they call sort of so-called doomers. But you know, I think the idea that we can just kind of smoothly manage our way out of this with, you know, existing political, monetary, technological means, I think is hopium. There is going to be some chaos, but I do think, you know, you do get renewal, and it does often come from the margins. You know, it's not going to come from Westminster or Washington. It will come from people locally, you know, having to deal with the difficult issues that come their way and figuring it out, you know. So, I mean, that's my belief, and in as much as that's the case, you know, there are grounds for hope, but I think it's about, you know, being realistic and working with other people, not hoping for some, you know, salvation technology to come down from on high.
I mean, it seems to me, I mean, as you said, we don't want to continue the status quo because the status quo isn't very good. I do think we need to define what it is we actually want to achieve, and I say in my book we should be trying to achieve convivial societies, personal fulfillment, flourishing biosphere. Would you agree with that broad scenario?
Absolutely, yeah, and sort of people as being part of that flourishing biosphere, you know, a human ecology as part of a wider ecology. And, you know, you mentioned morality earlier, you know, a kind of moral and ethical framework that kind of fits that. So, yeah, no, I do very much agree.
Great. Well, on a note, we've been agreeing all the way through, but that's a good place to end. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Colin. Pleasure talking with you.